We are in Holy Week, and that means we're taking a bit of a break from Romans. Past Sunday, we didn't hear a sermon from Romans. We heard a sermon introducing Holy Week. You know, we're getting toward Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And so today we have Lindsay, Chase, Mike, and myself, Dan. And first off, let's just talk about that. We're transitioning to a different section of Scripture, narrative, story. How, what are some effective ways that we can, read these different sections of story as opposed to, the Bible has poetry, the Bible has history, the Bible has, teaching and instruction. What's going on here with the life of Jesus? What is some of the value in hearing story?
Yeah, I think we transitioned from a letter, which Paul wrote. It was a public letter, which we don't do a lot of those these days, but it's a public letter to the church at Rome. And then by consequence, I think Paul intended for all churches to read that, to a first century biography. And so those are just different things. And so it's not that the story of the gospel is absent in Romans. Of course not. I mean, he literally says in chapter 1 and chapter 16, this is my gospel. He's bookending his public letter with the gospel. He's telling the story in it, but it's much more like, there's a lot more like annotated commentary. That's kind of what Romans is. There's a lot of commentary. Here's how you should be thinking about the story. Whereas a first century biography definitely had, and this isn't a bad thing, definitely had an agenda. Matthew had an agenda. Mark had every historian, history is not just, baldly recording facts.
Yeah.
Every historian has to be selective with which events he's going to share and what kind of, in a sense, story he ends up crafting out of that. So that's what historians do. So
That's why all four Gospels aren't the same.
exactly.
They're not identical.
Yeah. And so, theologian scholars will say, like Matthew had a more Jewish orientation, and Luke definitely had a more Gentile orientation, and John wrote later than everybody. He had more of a pre-existent Jesus, a higher Christology. Anyway, that type of thing. So, but anyway, the difference between Romans and this story here is like, this was more of, and you kind of heard it in the big idea, this was more about just like seeing Jesus, not a ton of commentary. Now, obviously some, and we primarily use Matthew and John Sunday. They definitely had ideas that they wanted communicated there, but it's almost like a good story well told has its own kind of power to be able to impact you in a different way than someone, annotating and commentating to you as well. Both are good. Chase, you were saying something about the function of first century biography to me.
Yeah, I got from Dale Allison, is that his name? His book on Matthew.
Dale Allison, by the way, is a very excellent commentator on Matthew, but keep going.
Yeah, he was talking about first century biographies and how the purpose of them is to first off, describe this person of influence, whoever it was. So some super influential figure. And then the second thing it was doing was like kind of trying to get something out of you, like something moral out of you, something to cause you to walk and live differently. And so obviously Matthew is all about, here's who Jesus is, the most influential person in all of human history, literally God. And here's how you can follow him and he can change your life. And so that totally makes sense. And he even comments too, the way we see biographies now is a little different. He says, and you can agree or disagree, but we kind of have biographies for information and for entertainment. And he's like, in the first century, it was like, oh no, we want to change your life. And so there are some things you learn from biographies, like modern biographies, but he's like, it seems like it's just more like reflecting and to learn something.
Sometimes we say, sometimes we can fall into a view of the Bible that it is just like a reference book. We talk about that sometimes. The Bible is not just a reference book. That is probably more, representative of more modern thought. And so even things like you just mentioned, about the four gospel accounts not being identical and even how they order things, us in our reference book, detail, mapping sort of thing is like, well, that's a problem. Because we are built on efficiency and we are like very linear and all that kind of stuff. So clearly there's a problem. That makes us suspicious, whereas that's not necessarily a concern otherwise. And so,
Yeah,
that kinda makes sense.
Matthew wasn't trying to include every single detail so that you would be like, historically, like, this thing happened after this thing specifically this way. He was definitely trying to communicate something.
Yeah, and I think too, while we're talking about this, like this kind of broaches into some reliability of the New Testament type conversation. And there's this principle in, as historians work with documents and trying to figure out what happened. You can't prove it, but you're talking about plausibility with history, likelihood, that type of thing. And they use this principle called the principle of similarity and dissimilarity, meaning if an event happened and multiple people are commentating on it, if all of the events were exactly the same, there's a suspicion about that.
Right.
There's no getting around
Sure.
suspicion
Right.
because it's like, well, then did you just follow one person's view of that?
You guys are all just writing the same thing.
Yeah. And so if all the Gospels were exactly the same, then those people who would be opposing the gospel would be like, oh, well, these are all just one perspective and it's a fraud and everyone just follow that. On the other hand, if they were like radically different, and there was contradictory information that, to the extent like Jesus didn't die or Jesus didn't rise or Jesus didn't actually feed the 5,000 or, so there's definitely discrepancies and people would even say maybe even contradictions within those New Testament Gospels. But the fact that they're dissimilar enough actually lends credibility. So it's kind of like they're actually in a sweet spot. There's enough similarity to be like, oh, these kind of corroborate each other. Matthew and Mark aren't using all of the same sources.
Right.
John is using different sources. It's like, oh, so there's different sources independently attesting to the reality of these events, and yet they're not all exactly the same. Actually shows you that there was, different people seeing the same thing. And so the principle of similarity to similarity, I think, is actually a viable thing. And that's you would do that at anything. You want to look at the Civil War, you want to find out what people's perspective are, look at firsthand accounts of those, and then try to find other firsthand accounts of those same events, and then corroborate them with each other, and then you can arrive at pretty confident, reliability that these things happen. And so that's how it is with Jesus, which is pretty remarkable, actually.
Yeah, it's really awesome.
People talk about the harmony of the God. Is that a good way to?
Yeah,
view that?
you can flatline things. So harmony works if, again, this music stuff keeps coming up with me, but people have to actually be playing different notes. Like Matthew, Mark, we can't expect them to be hitting the exact same note. Some of the bigger discrepancies, just to be out there, like John seems to have Jesus dying on Thursday, and
I didn't realize.
okay, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke have him on Friday, and there's definitely answers to that, like quote unquote answers, but the thing just exists. That's there. Another big one discrepancy that people have is the census for Jesus's birth. We don't have that independently attested anywhere else. A lot of the other gospel stuff, we do have other independent attestation to it. But that one we don't.
Like events, like
events.
historical events
so like
that are
Pontius
referenced?
Pilate. Yeah, Pontius
Okay,
Pilate. Like we have. It's actually funny. Pilate's known by Josephus and other ancient historians to be a bad leader, which I think is hilarious. I don't know why. It's just like because it corroborates the Bible. It's like this guy's wishy-washy. He's trying to like wash his hands of the event. It's
Right.
like you can't do that, brother. You're the one in charge. You can't be like, well, it's not my decision. It's, well,
Right.
no, it actually is your
Right.
decision.
Right.
So so there's whether it's events or people that were listed, dates, even geography. The eyewitnesses account of all those. One interesting thing would be like if someone was trying to forge something for the New Testament era, they would have had to have been like really familiar with common names. So the names Simon and Mary, a guy named Richard Balcom did this study, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, his book, and he was like, if you were trying to forge this 2 or 3 centuries later, they'd have to be like brilliant
Yes.
historians to know, because everyone seems to be named Simon. Simon Peter, Simon Serene, Mary Magdalene,
Well,
Mary
you have
Cleopas.
significant people who are like both named Mary.
Yes.
Jesus'
right.
mother,
And so
Mary
you'd have to know that. You'd have
Right.
to be like the familiarity with like the place of the skull and all of these like little details that are in the Gospels actually quote unquote betray, in the good sense, that people were just familiar with what was going on. They weren't trying to think of anything. Like if you were to ask me right now, like what are the most popular names that were in, I guess the equivalent would be like the Elizabethan era. I guess I'd pick George. I don't know, but you know what I mean. You see what I'm saying there. The Gospels themselves betray, in a good sense, just super familiarity with the actual biography of that day. It's because it's more likely that they were just there reporting what they saw.
So when you're dealing with sections of scripture like this, when you're dealing with story, you're dealing with history, this is like kind of one channel that you would definitely kind of swim in is, did these things actually happen, and can these events actually be trusted? So that's a whole conversation over there. You know, assuming some of that, let's assume, you know, that these things did happen, there's still value. It's not just proving them to be true. Okay, well, as long as we prove them to be true, then they must be effective. That must be enough. Like, no, we actually talk about, sometimes we'll use this expression, you know, letting the story shape us, or finding myself in the story, or something like that. And you even, with that last slide, you know, a couple of different things there. So let's kind of build on that a little bit. You know, it can be easier maybe in other sections of scripture when you have a clear command, or you have a statement, you know, don't think this, think that, and don't do this, do that. And, you know, you can kind of work around that. But when you're just kind of laying out the story, you know, some of these characters are really, you know, they're nuanced. Are they good guys? Are they bad guys? Should I just try to be like one of them? How do I actually go about intelligently and effectively kind of building on that last slide where I am in the story and finding my place in the story? What would be some practical steps forward on that?
Yeah, I would ask you guys to think of, this is on the spot, this is Livewire, everybody. What are some stories, and don't just say the overall biblical story. It could be story within the Bible, but like, what are stories that, like, I'll use the word, inspired you as a young person?
I am young, so I'm being inspired by all these stories.
Easy.
Easy in the moment.
So I was actually thinking about this as you were preaching. You know, how you were saying how Jesus was in control the whole time, but he was also like loving. So if I think back to when I was younger, and like I had heard the stories of Jesus since I was a child, and I think back about like, because I can't remember a lot about, you know, becoming in Christ, becoming a Christian. But if I think back, like, what was it that I knew about Jesus then? What was it that that was revealed to me about who he was? Like, what was the beauty of him that drew me to him as a child? And I think it was those two things. I knew that Jesus was strong, and I knew that he was kind. And I knew that, you know, I couldn't be with him because of my sin. And I basically, you know, like that song, I basically knew I could go to him because I knew that he was strong. I knew what he did. I believed he was God, that he made me. And I believed that he would accept me if I came to him. So I'm like, oh, when I hear this story, it actually like takes me back. And I'm like, tell me more about Jesus. Like he's the image of the invisible God. So I just need to see who he was, what he did, you know, and like, I still believe that he's strong and kind. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think those certain character traits, you know, pop out, whether it would be in the biblical story or whether it would be just you're hearing some story about somebody in history or somebody that accomplished something, you know, there's always the act that they did, but it would be very boring if it was just, you know, this person accomplished this, and it wasn't that amazing. But, you know, usually you're getting bits and pieces of how they treated people or something like that, you know, a particular like discipline that enabled them to accomplish such a thing, or maybe there was some unique moment in history. And so to be able to identify almost like mundane character traits, you know, just...
Even the word character, though, I want to point out there, it's like we think of that as like a moral thing when you say a character trait, but a character in a movie or a story is a character. It's a 3D thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so you just, you see like kind of the stockpiling of those small character traits that end up leading to significant things. And so even just kind of pulling that out, trying to think of different, stories that have impacted me over the years. Usually there are really big things that end up happening, but really small things that end up being true of the individual characters. And those things just kind of snowball.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think when we say we want the stories to shape us, that's kind of the thing I think we're talking about. We're looking at these stories and these people and who they are and what they're doing is inspiring us and motivating us to become like that. I think of it, I think it's a little bit more on the surface and easier to see, and maybe in its more pure form with children. It's like when I was growing up, it was like Luke Skywalker. Like I watched Star Wars. I wanted a lightsaber. I wanted to fight the forces of darkness.
I love when Haddon puts on like a towel or something and is like sprinting through the dining room and jumping with like some random object that he's going to poke his siblings with. That's not a sword. It's amazing. It's so great.
Yeah, and so I what he's doing there, and I think again, little image bearers, it's kind of more simple and cute, but it's like at the end of the day, as a more seasoned, older image bearer, I feel like that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to find people and specifically people, I guess, that I can look at and be like, I want to be like that. I think that's the best of biography. I do think a lot of our biography has, kind of maybe shifted toward the entertainment type thing, but I still think there's probably a good bit of it out there where, you can read biographies that are meant to inspire courage and, motivation or whatever. So the difference, obviously, with Jesus's biography, unlike any other, is that it really focuses on his death, which Ricky Watts talks about first century biography as well. I don't think a lot of other first century biographies really focus on people's death. Like a lot of people say the Gospels are basically just a commentary on Jesus's death with a little bit of prologue.
Right.
And so,
It's not necessarily something, that's not something like glorious to focus on. You can focus on like a battle they won or
Right.
when they stood up to some big thing or whatever. It's like
Which is Jesus
death
did
is
win a
different.
battle and he did stand up to
course.
things, but it's that gospel story where it kind of turns it on its head, up is down and down is
Yeah,
up. He
yeah.
dies or he wins by dying. So yeah, I think as we encounter the gospel stories, that's one of the things we're just kind of saying, like you were saying, like just show me more of Jesus, show me who he really is, because unlike other characters in the Bible, you can do that with to some extent. It's like, oh, I want to be courageous like David and Goliath. It's like, well, yeah, but avoid the Bathsheba murder Uriah part.
Right.
Right.
Or Abraham or these other people. There can be some, we can emulate their faith in Hebrews 11, but with Jesus, it's different. He is as you said, Lindsay, he is the fullness of God in human form. He is the express image of the invisible God. And so we want to behold him and become fully like him. There's nothing about those stories that we're looking at Jesus that we need to shy back from, but we just want more and more of him. And so that was part of what that type of sermon was, is just like, let's just kind of see Jesus again in some of these contexts, some of the details, and draw out who he is.
That's even what Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. He's like literally doing that. He's like hearing the Jesus story, and then he's like, well, I'm going to become like this guy. And then he's like, you guys become like me as I'm becoming like him.
Yeah.
Remembering is a big theme, obviously, in the scriptures. So the nation of Israel, they get led out of Egypt. They institute the Passover. It seems like the purpose is, we do these special things. We have this special feast so that your kids will say, why are you having this feast? And it's an opportunity to remember. So we practice the Lord's Supper, body and blood. But specifically in Holy Week, we're in the middle of Holy Week. And, you may do particular things. Maybe if you're listening, maybe you have particular traditions that you do. Maybe you don't, and you've never really thought of it, and you're thinking, it's Holy Week, I should be doing something. I should be reading something. How would you encourage people, maybe these stories are familiar, you can read the different sections of Scripture. The passages are pretty short. I mean, even though the Holy Week, as we call it, or the Passion Week, takes up a good chunk of the actual Gospels. Really, it's only a few pages in the Scriptures. So maybe you've read that time and time again. What encouragement would you give to people, or maybe what practices in like remembering special weeks, special dates like this? I know, you're doing the kids' Holy Week videos, Lindsay, and, the one yesterday was like remembering special days, and so these are special days, and we don't want to like glorify these days as if the gospel isn't true other days, but how can we go about kind of remembering special times in that church calendar? And we're right in the middle of one. What are some helpful things to do?
Well, I'm not particularly good at this. My, kind of gifting is teaching. So what I've done with our family, if you're just making it on a personal level, is I just try to teach. I've tried to teach the kids and Julie the story, which means we'll sit down and do a renewal time like other times, but we would focus on, those particular things and just drawing those out. And that's kind of like a little bit more my gifting and wheelhouse. So it wasn't special in the sense of like we did anything different, but it was definitely like, hey, let's really make sure we're doing
Like a
this.
thought focus.
Yeah,
kind
very
of thing.
focused. Like we want to do that. I would say as well, like a Good Friday service has been a ritual and practice for us over the years. When we were at the former church at Trinity, we couldn't always get into school on Good Friday, but we would pretty often we go to different churches and try to like really remember that day. And fasting as well has been a part of that at various times for me as well on Good Friday. So there's been a few things that we've done to kind of commemorate that and try to build that story into our mind a little bit better. And again, from a family standpoint, I felt like Julie's always done a good job of making the actual resurrection day, Easter, really focused on Jesus, but also something that we really celebrate. Sometimes we've had opportunities where our kids' friends who aren't believers, we've had them in a couple times in the past few years just to like do Easter with them. They, that's new for them. And so, yeah, just making that day a special day. Julie's done, a lot of good work to help our family in that way. So those are some of the things, but I'm sure there's other input and other people can do those things. Better may not be the right word, but more full.
Yeah.
I mean, I've usually done and my family's young and we're forming these habits now, but I've typically would read some type of devotional thing leading up. So there's a ton of them out there. There's like a whole bunch. Sinclair Ferguson has a good one, different things like that. So that would be.
You're talking about Lent there. Lent, that's a whole other category that the church has had for a long time. Is just the build up to Easter is actually Lent.
Right.
Which, go ahead.
But yeah, so those things are helpful because they just describe different little pieces. I think, honestly, since probably New City, have I really taken into consideration the actual week, like every day of the week. I've always celebrated Good Friday, Easter, obviously, Palm Sunday, but the actual events throughout the week have been kind of new since New City for me. So those are really great ways as well. All those books as well, they're actually that week. And so those are good things.
I think since New City as well, the whole buildup of the week, it's like helping to create the awe and wonder about the whole thing because like all of history hinges on this thing happening. And like this is how it went down. And just a newer concept is the church calendar. And I know that that's our construction, but it's like helping to remember and also create that on wonder and ordering a life around everything that God does, like that he did, that he's going to do. And so, I mean, it's just something that to explore. I mean, I'm not saying it's just something that I'm getting into, but just really focusing on that week and seeing what Jesus was doing, you know, the point of why he did everything. It's great to create the awe and wonder and really just highlights, you know, the majesty of him on the cross and then rising.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these special days, in the church calendar roll around every year. And so, I think it is really helpful to have some kind of tradition, some kind of memory, definitely even something physical. You mentioned, Chase, your little ones, they're like, you're forming these things. And, maybe you and your family aren't ready to lock into a few hours of silence where you're reflecting on the suffering and death of Jesus. But, there's probably small things that you can do, special dinners or whatever it might be, in order to like bring those things into remembrance. We were talking earlier, just kind of wondering, okay, the instruction was to do this Passover meal in the Old Testament, to have the children asking questions. I know even in modern like Passover type meals, there's questions, to like provoke the kids, like, hey, you should be asking about this. Here's some information. So, doing little things like that, I think, to help provoke some fresh thought and remembrance in fresh ways would be really great practice. So we do have a Good Friday service. We encourage folks to come back. What are some of the things that we would be doing in a Good Friday service? Maybe you've never been to Good Friday, wondering whether or not you should come, or maybe you haven't been thinking about coming. We would encourage you to come for sure. And what is that service like? Walk through kind of what we'll be doing in that service.
Yeah, it's not dramatically different than other services that we would do. Traditionally, a lot of Protestant churches do the Lord's Supper, which we will do, celebrate the Lord's Supper on that Friday. But also there's just a little bit more of a recognition, kind of lament. It's like a little bit, Good Friday is a really good day to remember that Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and that he bore his sorrows in his body on the tree. And so it's a good service to come together as a group of people and just kind of like remember. I love Dave's song, when we're reminded that the world is broken, that we're broken too. I love that little line in there. And I feel like not every service is that way. And there's still the hope of the resurrection is still there for us. We're not pretending like the resurrection hasn't happened, but we also don't want to pretend like everything is fine. And we also, it's good to set aside some time as a corporate body to remember that, Jesus did this for us, and actually because of it, he had to do this for us, that type of thing. And so I think that's what you can expect. So I think that's just really good. We've talked about kind of like lament services before, so it's a little bit more in that vein. And people might think, well, I don't know if I want to go to that. It's like, well, it's actually a way of healing. This therapy. It's like, by your wounds, you are healed. Like it's supposed to be therapeutic in that way. And it's also really encouraging to others, like to be surrounded by other people who are with you in your, maybe you don't think you're going through a hard time right now, but there might be other people in the church that are, and you coming and singing alongside of them and reciting the scriptures and praying together and celebrating the Lord's Supper with them can be really encouraging to them. We weep with those who weep, and we rejoice with those who rejoice. So that's what Good Friday is really about. And again, year after year after year, you kind of build that into your Christian experience. It's I really believe that's a healthy practice for churches to participate in.
Yeah, so we would encourage you to come Friday, 6:30, as we remember the death of Christ together, and then of course Resurrection Sunday, Easter Sunday, this Sunday. So we look forward to spending those times together.